Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Mocha Live podcast. My name is Max Cohen. I'm the writer for the Museum of Crypto Art. As I mentioned, this is the Mocha Live podcast. It is 2:06 p.m. EST, where I am and where Colborn is. Colborn, founder of the Museum of Crypto Art. How we doing?
All good.
Joining us as he does every week. And two special guests this week joining us from a couple of different time zones, if I am correct. Deja Tai and Anya Catherine, who together are the incredible digital art duo, generative art duo, choreographer duo, operator. Thanks so much for being here, you two. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
We have a lot to get into today. We're going to talk generative art in kind of a couple different facets. The kind of reason that, obviously the reason I wanted to have you two on this week is because just last week, your drop Human Unreadable on Art Blocks sold out. It was a really huge success, both like financially and also conceptually, in a space that I think lately is in desperate need of success for cool people who are doing things the right way. So awesome. Hell yeah for you guys. But there's also a trend that I've noticed, which is when we go down the list of works in crypto art today that seem to be like very sought after, we come up against these works like Fidenza's, where there was a recent $1 million sale, and Gazers and Ringers and Squiggles, and now Human Unreadable, right? These generative artworks that have larger mint counts, anywhere from 10,000 to 400 for Human Unreadable. And they inspire a kind of collecting that I think see elsewhere, really only with like PFP and other like DeFi projects, right? So it's really rare within the art world itself. The point being that it seems that at this moment in time, generative art seems to be sticking out against a backdrop of kind of a languishing crypto art environment that most of the space, I think, point blank, just seems to be stuck in. So first of all, Anya, what do you think the reason for that might be? It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, that's a big one to start. So I think kind of what you said about generative art being that there's hundreds of people that collect from the same collection kind of at the same time, normally, at the same time, and there being this and what you'll see is kind of communities forming around these projects where you have hundreds of people who within a short period of time got excited about an artwork and then all talked about it and compared them. I think maybe because of the number and because of the in more busy times in crypto art that everyone kind of like mints them within the same hour, and then this whole conversation starts around them, that it does maybe kick off projects like that and give them a sense of community and identity and belonging from the get-go that maybe someone who collects a one-of-one from an artist doesn't really have that suddenly hundreds of people that they have something in common with, to speak about and compare and kind of bond over. I don't know. I don't really think about that question often, but I think it's a really important one. But just our initial feeling, I think, from not working in this medium, never making hundreds of pieces, we've never done that before, and just feeling the difference from when we release a one-of-one or we do a like performance installation where people are being anonymized one at a time, which doesn't have that kind of volume even humanly possible, that I instantly felt the difference when there was hundreds of people in Discord comparing projects, talking about what they liked, getting each other excited about the work. So I have to think from my personal view of someone who didn't make that kind of work to now someone who sees what happens when hundreds of people get excited about one thing at the same time. I think it creates a kind of bonding and conversation that maybe can help people want to keep that alive longer than if it's an isolated artwork.
Deja, what do you think?
I would continue and extend upon what Anya just said, because, this is the first generative artwork that we've created
Mhm.
in this manner. And our work is generally participatory. There's an audience participant who's, completing the work. And so in this, I felt like that participatory element was the moment of the minting. And
Mhm.
I guess I didn't think too much ahead of time of like what that experience would be like. But there was this type of experience that was happening, as you were saying, Anya, in Discord, where I just kind of saw it unfold before my eyes of like, oh, I get it. Like I get why there is a bond between the collectors, and I get like, and we were part of that excitement ourselves because we were experiencing the work as it was unfolding, which isn't abnormal for us, because our work is experiential, and that is a beautiful cat. Hello, welcome to the podcast.
This is
Um,
every podcast that cat ends up in Colborne's lap.
so I would just extend what Anya was saying, because I think it allows, it becomes more participatory in that way. Of course, there's limits within who can participate, maybe based on like price point and quantity, and that should be noted as well.
Sure. Colborne, in your history, how a couple questions, but like how has generative art collection today changed from maybe 2018, 2019? And then like do you have a lot of generative art in your collection as well?
I have some real gems. I was always, I'll call it late or not understanding, or it didn't speak to me, maybe because it was too much kind of in the middle, right? Maybe because it was speaking to more people. I understood the one of one narrative, and I didn't. And then, to me, it felt like open editions came before really like one of X, and open editions really left a sour taste in my mouth, right? Because what is this when it's like so reproducible? Now,
Hmm.
what I did not account for was this idea of, and I should have known, like how important it is to like bootstrap community around a project where everybody is engaged, they're involved, and they have their own like desire to be in like that group and have that connection with each other and the artist. I always kind of, and this is probably like, backwards thinking, but like art as more of like the solo endeavor. I did not understand what distribution meant. I didn't understand kind of what like scale meant. And at the end of the day, blockchain is really like a fantastic distribution mechanism that allows for like value aligned incentives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think. I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to return actually to something you said earlier, Max, when you kind of positioned it as, I don't know if you said it's between like 10K PFP projects and like art, but I think there is something to that logic, because I think people wonder why. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why like 10K PFP projects, um, and people often, especially people in the art scene, are like, why would you buy that like ugly thing, so people have that kind of feeling about a lot of that. But I think what they're missing is that, a lot of people are not buying it because of the picture. They're buying it exactly because of like what we're talking about, which is like this feeling of belonging that like happens instantly. And so I think what's interesting about generative art, and what we've gotten like a little bit of a taste of, is what does it look like when you don't have people just rallying around like increasing the value of something, but actually creating a community around being excited about an artwork, rather than being excited around a club, or the club not being just about making that thing more valuable, but the club being around supporting an artist or supporting a vision. And so kind of getting out of um, the solo artist mindset, which we've always also kind of been. And this is the first time, and like I feel pretty allergic to the word community, as do many people. But it does do something when you have many people that are helping to elevate your project and are excited. And we're trying to see how we can, leverage that momentum and conversation and steer it towards figuring out uh, what that what that power can do when it's actually about art or around an artist
Hmm.
for real.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that when I say that they're like between 10K PFP projects and one of ones, like I mean like actually numerologically,
Yeah.
but well, and maybe that was obvious. But I also think it's interesting that we've seen in a moment where I just read something yesterday about like a Moonbirds dropping 95%, right? And that project kind of being a failure or conceived of as a failure by its community. The kind of similar analogs, right, to the, I guess, like the really sought after generative art projects, like I mentioned before, the Squiggles, the Gazers, the Ringers, the Fidenzas, those are maintaining
Mhm.
cultural capital in a way that a lot of these PFP projects don't seem able to, right? Really outside of punks and Bored Apes, everything is kind of, prone to, hitting the shitter at any specific moment. And there's some pull that I think people are having, Anya, to what you were saying. There's an identification with these various facets of artistry that I think are really palpable in how people are treating the works themselves. Deisha, why do you think that generative, maybe like also abstract artworks, are so kind of perfect a repository for people to kind of not only have this community, but also to like hold fast to it when a lot of other things seem to be kind of free falling?
Hmm. Well, I think the generative aspect allows for volume, right?
Mhm.
And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. Um, I mean, how I want to answer this question is like kind of going to what I observed in the interactions in Discord and on Twitter as Human Unreadable was going down the release and even afterwards, where it allows for people to create, and this is back to the community, but like create connection around specific aspects of a work and the variations on that work. And I'm even thinking about like the different curiosities that tend to like build and extend upon that. So like for instance, I'm noticing a whole group of people who are bonding and creating like learning together about choreography in
Mhm.
Discord. So these are people who, are punks and apes and maybe used to collectibles or fidenzas or abstract works that maybe don't include the human body whatsoever, but suddenly they're interested in that. And it's not because maybe necessarily that all of a sudden they're like, yeah, you know what, I do like dance, but it's the medium that allowed it for them to be accessible because they were already open to generative art and this like the medium itself. And so there was, I think, like maybe a trust in the medium that allowed almost like a gateway into something a bit more experimental as well. So I don't know if I'm like totally answering your question about the notion of like why the abstract is holding up so much, but Anya, I see you smiling. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, well, I think that this is obviously a guess, but I think if there's something that it's difficult for people to like really argue over, it's almost like, how Deja's mom just does um, in like her line of work of like designing homes. We ask her about like certain choices that she makes, and sometimes she's like, yeah, but this needs to be for the 90%.
Hmm.
So when she's staging a home, she's like, I would make this wall bright purple, but this is staged and like it needs to be pretty much anyone who comes in the house can see themselves living there. Like it can't be something that like pushes or has too strong of like a choice or too bold. Like leopard, no, because you'll turn off a lot of the population, you know? And so it's like choices that I think are likable. And I don't say this in a rude way. It doesn't mean they're not good choices. It just means I think that a lot of the work and like abstract work, even if you look at like Artsy's recent reports, like abstract painting is like what people spend the most money on. And so I think there is this idea of if you're collecting art that you want something that like most people maybe will also like or enjoy with you. And I think why I we love the work, but I don't think we were thinking this is really for the 90%.
Mm-hmm.
We really made something that we knew people would be like, what body, what too harsh, too messy. Like we kind of knew we were making choices that like if this was a house being staged would not be for the 90%. And so I think that's why we were so moved and so happy when it got the response that it did and from people that we really respect, because I think it showed that maybe there's even an underestimation of what these kinds of collectors are open to or how far they're willing to go into art and into experimentation, and not just sticking to, you know, something that's difficult to have a fight about over dinner, you know? And so I think that showed us a lot about the collectors in the community. I think we didn't really understand or expect was there, was like willing to go out on a limb. And the second thing I'll say, which is kind of unrelated, but equally made me really happy, is like several collectors are like, my wife is a dancer and she knew who Merce Cunningham was. So like a lot of the collectors' wives and girlfriends and partners are like, oh my God, there's cool dance shit happening in your world that I usually like. I usually don't like what you collect or understand it, but they hear like dance or Yvonne Rainer or Merce Cunningham, and suddenly they're like, whoa, I have like something to say about something you just collected. So I also love that there's even kind of a gender dynamic shifting where a lot of dancers who are usually not in these conversations, their ears are perking up and they're like, there's something for me over in crypto art. Like that's really cool and exciting.
And there's an expansion too of, and I think what Anya answered should have been the first part of to your question, to the first response, but extending the scope of what people are interested in, and it's like still like to go into Discord and to hear, to jump in and see collectors and supporters of the project talk about the choreo, and they're like, okay, so the choreo is going to be revealed end of June. Very interested in how that's going to work. And they're just talking about choreography and like really wanting their choreography that created their piece. Like, this is incredible. Or we're giving, you know, some context. And we suggested watching One Day Pina Ass, which is a documentary about Pina Bausch, directed by Chantal Ackerman. And someone went in there and actually watched it and came back and reported back like what they thought. And so it's, and they're also so excited about the performance. So I think like it you know, we can widen outside, we can widen generative art outside of the abstract. I think there's more there, but it certainly is. I do think the medium of generative art was unexpectedly a nice gateway to onboard other folks to the interest of performing arts.
So it's interesting, not just with Human Unreadable and it's being a gateway drug for choreography, but that this is, I think, something that we're seeing elsewhere within crypto art, these other mediums, or the other art forms that are kind of finding, I don't know, an entryway into the crypto art world, or an entryway from themselves, maybe like a portal into themselves within crypto art. I'm thinking specifically of like Ana Maria Capiero and Sasha Stiles and the Verse doing that with poetry. And I guess the question that comes off of it is like, how did you two kind of reach the understanding that generative art, I mean, A, was required to capture this like choreographic moment, but also that it could, you know, interact with choreography? Because I think that that's, I don't know, kind of like next level, second tier thinking. They don't seem on their face to be compatible at all.
Well, Onion and I's practice have the human body at the core of the practice. So my background is in human computer interaction. So I'm a technologist, but also an immersive artist. And Anya's a choreographer and a performance artist. And so technology and the body are, what's the material of each artwork that we create. And so for the collection, the privacy collection, which Human Unreadable is the most current lot within that, this is an ongoing series that's really site specific to crypto culture. And each kind of lot is looking at a different site within crypto culture. And so for this one, PFPs were one when we anonymized 67 collectors' portraits with the privacy portraits for one example. But Human Unreadable, the site to create for was generative art, long form generative art. And so the criteria for that collection is being site specific, but then also this like tension between privacy and transparency inherent in blockchain technology, and the challenge and the focus of bringing the human body to blockchain art, to crypto art, because we were seeing that there was a lack of the human body, or we wanted to challenge ourselves rather to extend the human body more to this medium and to this craft. And so it was a personal challenge for us, just because it's one of the main materials of our practice. And so we said, well, how would we make generative art and the human body, jive? And when we met with Eric Snowfro almost a year ago now during NFT Zurich Art Day, NFT Zurich Art Day. Yeah. We discussed this with him, and we discussed the notion of generative choreography. And this was something that was also really interesting to him. So a couple of months later, I think it was in August of 2023. 2022. Time traveling here. That's when we started to like think about, well, how would we bring the body on chain? And so that was a 9-month solution. To figure that out. So, I mean, that's how we arrived at knowing that's where we wanted to go. But then what happened from there was a process of like, it was a technical process, very much an engineering feat as well. But that's how we arrived there. And so it wasn't really thought of through the perspective of like, well, how do we, get generative art folks to be into choreography? But that just kind of ended up being a result. But it was intentional to bring the human body into crypto art in any way manageable by us.
Coburn, I'd like to return to something that Anya said before, which is that Human Unreadable is generative artwork for the 10% as opposed to the 90%. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, perhaps this is a loaded question, but like, what does generative artwork for the 90% look like in your eyes? So to me, I'll take a little bit of the weight off of you, but I think about Unsupervised, the Rafik Anadol piece, which is super innocuous. It's beautiful, but we've talked about it before. Super innocuous. There's a reason that people who don't have any real relationship to art flock to the MoMA lobby and look at this piece, because it is, I think, purposefully, I don't say that as like a slight, but I just say that as it is for universal appeal. But Coburn, what do you think?
Well, look, I grew up in this space on kind of like art for the timeline, right? That when you use Twitter as your curation engine for what you're producing, right, you end up ultimately creating art for the 90%, right? So at the end of the day, like, are you producing for yourself, which is something like Operator was very intentional about knowing what they were going to produce, and then instead of like having the aesthetic continue to define what you're going to produce and having that feedback loop on the aesthetic, right? They started with a concept and they developed a project that ended up with a beautiful aesthetic, but it wasn't aesthetic forward, right? So when you begin to think of like what art is for the timeline, it's going to be like flashing imagery, bright colors, like swirly motion. So, I think when you begin to like look at the other types of generative art projects that have done well, you end up seeing that there is a different aesthetic, but it's also so much more beyond that. And something like we haven't really touched on is just like the deep process that went into this, and the amount of education that they did, and the amount of like behind the scenes community support building that went into this as well, to just make sure people were educated on the concept, so that when the aesthetic was presented, there was a deeper understanding and relationship with it. And then of course, there's 400 of these, so that does kind of appeal to the 10% of collectors, as opposed to larger edition sets.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought about the aesthetics coming before or after the process. I think just in my practice being a writer, there's no separating the two things, because they inform each other so much from the outset. You need, the aesthetics being, I guess, like word choice itself, but these things start to seep back into the themes and processes that you're using to like put a novel or a short story together. And then they kind of can't be, I don't know, unlinked after a certain point, because they're just one is growing out of the other. I was reading about Gogol, the Russian writer, and his use of a dialectic technique called scat, which is writing from the perspective of a narrator that isn't knowledgeable but thinks they're very knowledgeable. It was this like very like Russian street presence. And so that, if you're using that voice, that's going to affect the kind of details in the story you're telling and the attitude towards the character. And your attitude towards a character that's in, some kind of distress can end up being one of vicious irony or one of great compassion, depending, I think, on, the tenderness of the language that you're using. So I don't know, just a little writerly insight from that side of things. I've been researching generative art for some time, never in depth, but I have the conversations frequently about it. And something that I think is so interesting is that the public, whether it's the crypto art public or the wider public, seems to have this understanding that generative art is a product of the now, when it's very clearly been a lineage that's been building for quite some time. Vera Molnar was using algorithmic processes as early as 1968. Which is not a fact that I'm coming up with off the top of my head, but nevertheless remains true. So something nevertheless has changed in our attitude towards generative art, either the way we're accepting it or the way we're interacting with it. And it's gotten I think very clearly, like an exponential amount of success and acceptance, which to me honestly feels a little bit unsustainable. And my question, Deja or Ani, whichever of you would like to take it, is like, should it even be sustainable? Or should generative art remain niche?
I would love to just see it continue to mature. And like, I like the fact that there's a lot of people that through collecting generative art suddenly are interested in this museum show at LACMA that like 3 years ago they would have never gone to LACMA, but suddenly because they collected this piece and then they learned about early generative art because it's connected to this artwork that they owned, that maybe they weren't even like trying to really get into art, but now they're at LACMA looking at, plotter drawings from the 70s. I think that's really cool. And I think what I would like to see, and what I think, I don't know, would be a desirable outcome is that is that it's not about hype, but it's more about deeper contextualization, looking at what's being done and having that historical knowledge, figuring out how it can evolve to be part of other practices and like other mediums, and it being a way for this audience to have a deeper appreciation for art in general, or like in the way that now we have, generative art collectors that are curious about performance. Like that, I think, is a victory, and it's a really cool way for generative art to keep evolving. So it's not like it needs to stay niche. I just think it would be really cool is to harness the interest, but have it grow in a more mature direction, instead of trying to keep up just like hype over whatever, but have it become maybe like slower and deeper and more interested in where it can go conceptually, theoretically, artistically.
Deja, what do you think?
I have no allegiance to any one medium, so my care is not necessarily, and I don't mean this rudely, for generative art. I think if it makes sense for the concept of the work, or if it makes sense to an individual or a collective who that's the core of their practice, then that's that's something that needs tending to, right? But as a because I care about art, I care about art more than generative art. And so what I mean by that is that um,
Mhm.
I rather it not be generative art if it has to, if in order for it to still remain art, right? So that means like if I'm just leaning into generative art because of the market mechanisms and because of the hype, then now all of a sudden I've lost the art part. So if it can serve both, then wonderful. And there's been, I mean, I started studying processing and emergent systems and coding, generative programs when I, like in 2005, when I was a freshman in university, and got the like Casey Ria's Ben Fry processing book, and so like it's been near and dear for me for like quite a long time. But at the same time, the allegiance isn't there, and it's just sort of has kind of because of the hype around generative art, which some of it is beautiful and breathtaking and conceptually strong, but then of course there's others that feel like maybe they're just there for the hype, and I think you can very clearly understand which is which. um, and so I agree with Anya in that the maturity, like now is the time for the maturity to kind of like have. I think it's helpful when the hype goes away,
Mhm.
because then the art just remains, and the artists who are generative artists and define themselves as a generative artist, now they have the room back to um, focus on what is the artwork, or if someone comes in to leverage that medium because it makes sense for a concept of the work, they can focus on the work and not the hype. So that's my thought.
I want to linger on something you said, which I also want to push back on slightly, which is you mentioned, like, I think most of us can tell the difference between, the work that has thought and intention and the work that is like mass produced, so to speak. Colborn and I spoke briefly on this last week. And I had made the point that generative art is so mysterious to me, right? I have no coding ability. So the idea of taking this output or this code and finding an output out, it seems kind of magical in a way that I think a lot of art to a lot of people may not in this day and age, because these skills are so reproducible in a lot of arenas. And Colburn pushed back on that, and you said something along the lines of, anybody can find a lot of these codes, or a lot of this code online. You can copy and paste it into the right place and make some kind of beautiful output. Um, at least Colburn, that's what my recollection of our discussion.
Yeah, there's like obviously open source processing code that allows me to go just like copy paste and generates just by changing the parameters, right? I don't necessarily need to code, and I'm sure with like some sort of help from AI, I could even do that in a way that could be indistinguishable from the form without knowing really anything about coding.
But my point being that I personally am not sure that if you expose me to 10 generative artworks at random and said that half of these were created by a really thoughtful process and half of them were just abstract outputs that were, I don't know, taken from online and run through an AI generator and pushed out through whatever process, I'm not sure I could tell the difference without knowing a lot about the artistry, without knowing a lot about the context.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, my first thought there is like I think of jazz musicians who will play a solo with like one note, like a 2-minute solo with one note, and it's incredible. And maybe it doesn't take a lot of technical skill, but it takes a lot of soul. And so even if I'm reusing code that exists, but I'm doing it in a way that makes something new. And I have a conceptual grounding and conceptual strength. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to do what we did with Human Unreadable, which is like make it an entire method of, generative dance and spend 9 months with engineers and dancers all around the world. Like you could do that, but like also there's other ways to make soulful, real art that's feel based. And I think it's okay that people are using, open source code, but so long as they're doing something with it, we use open source code, like and then we're providing our code, to the world as well. Like that's how it works. But I think at the same time, it's what you do with it, with like the limited resources that you have. And I also think, I say this more, at least from operators output, like, I don't really care if people know how we made it. I think it's interesting if for people who want to go there with us and go on that journey, then they have a lot, like there's a lot of depth there, and they can come on that journey. But I also feel that, the artwork should be able to be experienced without any of that context as well. So I don't think there needs to be this expertise, Max, like what you're saying, where it's like you need to know, okay, this was difficult to make or whatnot. But like, does it make you feel something, and does it feel genuine?
Interesting. Yeah, but I think that's a problem with abstract art in general, right? And I think the example of jazz is kind of in a similar like musical arena, and I think of poetry as well, where it's really hard to gauge. I think about like the nonsense poets, right? Like Ezra Pound or E. E. Cummings. Like it's really hard to know if a nonsense poet or nonsense poem is the product of like I don't know, something more than just randomized outputs. I remember like in high school, we would have these poetry seminars, right, over the period of weeks. And it was really easy to put together a poem that sounded like, the greats of the 1920s, because you could just kind of put words together, put a couple of line breaks in there, use some onomatopoeia, and just kind of call it a day. So I think it's interesting, right, that like that extends, I think, to generative art in a lot of respects. And so I agree with you that you want to feel something and you want to have this kind of initial attraction to the piece, but I think the context becomes so important when dealing with abstract work, because I think that personally that's my way of becoming like in awe of artists or an artwork the way I have with you two and with Human Readable, versus just seeing any given generative output and understanding that it's abstract and that I'm going to impress whatever I'm going to put upon it, but having, I think, a similar reaction to it that a lot of people have when they go to museums and see abstract artwork, which is like, what's the point of this? I don't get it. Why is this art? Colburn, I'm curious why, if maybe you think that there's a reason jumping off of that thought, if maybe that's the reason why abstract artwork and generative artwork specifically have found this, I don't know, momentary stranglehold on crypto art over like representational artwork.
It's interesting because the things that are the most polarizing are generally the things that do well in this space, right? So when somebody shows up to that museum, and this is probably true in life, and they say, I don't understand this, well, that is like either, an invitation for them to go deeper, right, and try and understand it, or an invitation to kind of just walk away. Whereas maybe if you see something that is figurative, you're like, oh, I understand this. Here is like somebody sitting and whatever, drinking a cup of coffee, right? And that is understandable, and that is relatable, and that doesn't like capture and engage and pull so much deeper. So like when you bring it like way down the line to PFPs, like I think the reason Bored Ape Yacht Club was so successful is because there were equally as ardent haters as there was like ferocious supporters. and you can't like understand, there is no commonality of like, I do not see myself in this, or like I really see myself in this and understand.
Mhm.
And perhaps we've lost Max.
Oh no.
We're still here.
There he is.
There you are.
Hi, so sorry. The last thing I heard was something PFPs.
Yeah, I mean, like I think generally just like the most polarizing thing has been generally very successful.
Mhm.
Right? And that is either like you see it and you identify it, or you don't see it, you don't understand it, you can't believe people are identifying with this. So, you know, we live in a time of extreme emotions, right? And like value is being pushed and accrued to really extreme places, right? So when there is no like center, it's very, very difficult to kind of understand like where you are and where you fit. And that's why we see, I think, so many people like trying to find more and more community around anything that could be like a maybe a metaphorical center, proverbial center. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what you just said is also like the same logic of US politics right now. And you also can't
Totally.
separate that from engagement, and maybe the things that are polarizing become successful because they have the most people talking about it. And in the end, it's just about, you know, whether you love it or you hate it, you're still making that thing more popular, you know?
Hmm.
So I think it's the same logic that applies here. And I feel like going back to the subject of like generative art, and not questions of like good and bad, because I don't actually think like good and bad is an interesting like way to categorize or even like judge art. But I know we definitely with Human Unreadable, we're just thinking like, okay, so this audience obviously responds to this kind of art. Like it's not saying a value judgment on that kind of art. But we knew that, like, for example, if we made something more colorful, because a lot of people were like, that crowd doesn't like black and white. You know, like we were told things that we could do that like would maybe make this safer or more comfortable, or not too outside the comfort zone of like what that audience responds to, has demonstrated that they have a taste for, that they, you know, want to hang on their wall. So there were things that we could have done that I think would have put us more in line with the demonstrated taste and preference of like what that audience, like what kind of work they resonate with. And so I think rather than it being about quality, it was more just about let's see what else maybe resonates with them that might even surprise them themselves. And I think that's what was really fun, is that we ignored pretty much all the advice of like what, you know, would do well commercially, like in this kind of way, because it goes like in a completely other direction. But I think that's exciting, and it's also what art should do. Is, you know, you see something and you're like, why does that make me feel that way? You know, why does that resonate with me? Why do I feel uncomfortable? Why do I feel vulnerable looking at this? And we more wanted this work to be something that, yeah, people realize something about themselves through, or they felt comfortable looking at something that maybe a year and a half ago would have been too extreme for them, but they've like, you know, established a taste, and suddenly this was okay and approachable to like be comparing. Mine has feet, oh, mine has nipples. And you're not talking about like in a sexual way, you're just like, I'm looking at this artwork I own of a woman's body. Like there's so much to unpack here that I think is really interesting.
So I want to wrap up in a couple of moments, but I'd like to grab everyone's opinion on a question that I think is a really good place to leave off, and jumping off of Human Unreadable, which is generative choreography, but it obviously requires a professional's intense knowledge of both mediums, right? It's your two specific skill sets and specific histories that allow to work like this to jump into existence, right? And I know I mentioned the verse folks earlier, but there's a a confluence of intense understanding of machine processes and also of poetic practices, which are going to allow those outputs to kind of exist. And I'm interested. I think a lot about what arenas for generative art haven't really been dabbled into, but are kind of, I don't know, sit at a logical conclusion. Um, does that make sense? Like, what are the furthest limits of generative art in this or that arena? Ones that have been, practiced or explored so far, or ones that haven't, that maybe you've seen or have thought about or pontificated on? Deja, I don't know if you want to start.
I can tell you what I'm interested in seeing,
Please.
which is generative art that isn't that is outside the rectangle, that is outside of the screen. And I think have seen that in the past with chance operations and computational choreography and performance, as you've seen maybe in EAT in the 60s as well, Black Mountain College. And we certainly tried to do that with Human Unreadable, where, by the third act, you are completely out of the screen, but still experiencing generative art. So for me, I am very interested in artists doing explorations in generative art that take us outside of the multimedia box.
Interesting. Anya, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of similar, but something that when someone hears that it's something that stands alone as an artwork, that then someone can appreciate and like, and then find out that it's generative without necessarily knowing that at the beginning. Like, I think that's exciting for people. Like, we always think about this with the performance of maybe someone who just, went to a museum on a Saturday and sees a performance and just thinks it's another performance and doesn't realize they're watching generative art. So that, I think, is really exciting. So I think more ways where you see something, and then when you're told it's generative art, you're surprised, because when you if you imagine, if you close your eyes and you think of generative art and like what you picture, it just falls so far away from that kind of mental picture that comes up. So I'm excited to see, how people can take the medium and use it in ways that are like unrecognizable, surprising. I think there's so much to explore.
Coborn, take us home.
All right, because it's the end of the podcast, I'm going to tell you my terrible ungenerative art idea that I had. And have you seen the movie Arrival, right? With the aliens that are kind of squids and they're communicating in like this bloody ink language, and this linguist has to go and like figure that out. If you haven't, that's kind of the initial concept. And I use like this charcoal toothpaste, and I always end up like spitting into this white sink, right? So I wanted to capture like 100 of those, and then say I used like AI to interpret some sort of language out of this, but really then just like write pretty garbage poems. So none of it would be generative, other than like I'm generating it, and it's all kind of just like kind of a waste, or just like nothingness. But then say it's generative, and to say it's AI, and kind of sell it as that is my idea of like ungenerative art.
Would you have a big data set too? Like
every time I brush my teeth, like twice a day, maybe for a year.
Yeah.
You can see how your spitting habits change by the month.
Yeah, I just need like a big white porcelain sink.
Oh my god.
Well, as a wise person once said, no, we should encourage you. I want the toothpaste project. We always end up talking about basketball at the end of these podcasts, which I see as like a treat or a punishment for people who've made it this far. And this week it'll be Coborn's toothpaste generative art idea.
Love it.
Yeah, next week we'll just move on from here to bad art project ideas.
Yeah, well, the basketball season's about to be over, so we'll have to find something to put at the end of these podcasts. All right, this seems like a great place to wrap up. Anya, Deja, thank you so much for being here with Coborn and I. This was a lovely conversation. This has been another edition of the Mocha Live podcast, and we will be back next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. I guess it won't be the same time. It'll be a different time, but all right. We'll be back next week. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll see you next week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you both.